One man retired undefeated, a global icon of discipline, humility, and dominance. The arm, destroying opponents in minutes and demanding the world's attention. Khabib Nurmagomedov, the Eagle of Dagestan, and Khamzat Chimaev, the Wolf of Chechnya, should have been natural allies. Brothers in faith, warriors from neighboring homelands, two Muslim champions reshaping the fight game. Instead, whispers of rivalry turned into headlines, and respect gave way to tension. Social media posts, subtle digs, and fiery call-outs transformed a dream matchup into one of MMA's most heated what-ifs. Fans began asking, is this about legacy, loyalty, or something deeper? Dagestan versus Chechnya, humility versus chaos? This isn't just a clash of fighters, it's a clash of identities, of philosophies, of pride. And to understand how Khabib and Khamzat went from shared respect to whispered conflict, we need to go back to where it all began. When Khabib Nurmagomedov stepped away from the octagon in October 2020, he didn't just retire undefeated, he retired as one of the most respected figures in the history of the sport. At 29-0, he was the definition of dominance, a fighter who had never truly been beaten, who had mauled legends and contenders alike with his signature grappling style. But Khabib's power went far beyond the cage. In Dagestan, Khabib wasn't just a fighter, he was a symbol. A devout Muslim, he lived his career guided by discipline, faith, and humility. He spoke softly, dressed modestly, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with many of his peers. He refused alcohol sponsors, spoke against trash talk that crossed moral lines, and constantly reminded young fans that faith and family came before fame. For a region marked by hardship and political tension, he embodied a rare figure of pride. Every time Khabib fought, Dagestan would pause. Villages, towns, and cities gathered around TVs, watching their champion carry their name to the world. His father, Abdulmanap, was a revered coach who had built fighters from the ground up, instilling values of loyalty and respect. When Abdulmanap passed away in 2020, Khabib promised his mother he would never fight again. That promise was enough for him to retire at the top, walking away with his legacy intact. In many ways, Khabib was more than a fighter. He was an example of how combat sports could align with principles. He didn't just win fights, he preached discipline, integrity, and humility. And to millions, he wasn't just the Eagle of Dagestan, but a role model whose values seemed untouchable. But legends don't exist in a vacuum. As Khabib's story reached its perfect ending, another figure was rising fast, one whose style and swagger couldn't have been more different. And soon, the comparisons would spark a storm. If Khabib was the eagle who soared with discipline and patience, Khamzat Chimaev was the wolf who tore through his prey with ferocity. Born in Chechnya, raised in Sweden, Khamzat carried the fire of a fighter with something to prove, not just to the UFC, but to the world. His UFC debut in 2020 was like nothing the promotion had seen before. Within 10 days, he fought and won 2 times, dominating his opponents so badly that commentators struggled to find words. He ragdolled professional fighters like they were amateurs, then knocked out others in seconds. The UFC's hype machine kicked in immediately. Fans asked if this was the birth of the next Khabib. But Khamzat didn't want to be the next anything. He wasn't interested in following a blueprint. While Khabib had built his career on humility and soft-spoken answers, Khamzat was brash, wild, and unapologetically loud. He screamed, "Smash everybody!" into microphones, called out champions left and right, and promised to dominate entire divisions. He didn't care about being politically correct. He cared about chaos. The contrasts were clear. Where Khabib built his image on calm respect, Khamzat thrived on unpredictability. Where Khabib rarely insulted opponents, Khamzat taunted them openly. And yet, both men shared a connection through faith, through roots in the Caucasus, through the weight of being Muslim fighters on the global stage. For a time, it seemed like they were destined to support each other. In interviews, Khamzat even praised Khabib, calling him a champion and a legend. But beneath the surface, there was tension. Fans, media, and even UFC executives began framing Khamzat as the heir to Khabib's throne. And for Khamzat, comparisons felt like a chain holding him down. He didn't want to be the next Khabib. He wanted to be bigger. It was only a matter of time before those comparisons turned into conflict. To understand why the Khabib versus Khamzat conflict escalated so quickly, you have to look at the history of Dagestan and Chechnya. Both regions sit in the North Caucasus. Both are predominantly Muslim, and both have endured decades of hardship, war, and political upheaval. Their people are tough, proud, and fiercely loyal to their communities. But pride can breed rivalry. For years, Dagestan and Chechnya shared a complicated relationship. While they are neighbors, their cultural identities are distinct, and their histories have sometimes put them at odds. Sports often became a stage for those rivalries, with fighters from each region representing more than themselves. They represented their people. When Khabib rose to the top, Dagestan celebrated like never before. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a hero. Chechens respected him too, but there was an undercurrent of competition. Then came Khamzat, a Chechen-born wrecking ball, and suddenly the spotlight wasn't Dagestan's alone. Fans on social media poured fuel on the fire. Every time Khamzat smashed another opponent, comparisons to Khabib lit up Twitter, Instagram, and MMA forums. Who's better, Khabib or Khamzat? Would Khamzat dominate Dagestani fighters? The narrative wasn't just about two men. It became Dagestan versus Chechnya, humility versus aggression, tradition versus chaos. The tension wasn't just imagined. Fighters from both camps began making subtle remarks. Khabib's circle emphasized loyalty, respect, and earning your place. Khamzat's team fired back with boasts, suggesting Dagestani fighters didn't want to test themselves against him. Soon, it wasn't just an internet debate, it was a cultural one. The idea of Khabib and Khamzat clashing wasn't just exciting to fans, it was symbolic, the embodiment of two proud regions colliding. And while both fighters initially avoided direct shots at each other, the undercurrent was clear. Something was building. And then, with a single post on social media, the quiet rivalry burst into the open. At first, the tension between Khabib and Khamzat existed mostly in the whispers of fans and headlines of journalists eager to stoke a rivalry. Both men rarely addressed each other directly, but the silence left room for speculation. That silence, however, wouldn't last forever. The first sparks came in the form of subtle comments during interviews. Khamzat, riding the momentum of his incredible UFC debut run, was asked repeatedly about Khabib. The questions were always framed the same way. Are you the next Khabib? Could you beat Khabib? Do you see yourself as the successor to Dagestan's eagle? At first, Khamzat deflected with praise. He called Khabib a legend, acknowledged his achievements, and made it clear that he respected him. But as the questions kept coming, his answers began to shift. Instead of only praise, there was a tone of frustration, an insistence that he was his own man, not a copy. Meanwhile, Khabib's camp wasn't blind to the hype. Ali Abdelaziz, Khabib's outspoken manager, was quick to temper expectations. He dismissed comparisons, saying Khamzat was talented but had a long way to go before being mentioned in the same breath as Khabib. In Dagestan, whispers circulated that Khamzat was being reckless, skipping the lines of respect and hierarchy that defined their culture. The real ignition point, though, came with a single social media post. On Instagram, Khamzat shared a photo with a caption implying that certain fighters, Dagestani fighters, were avoiding him. He never used Khabib's name directly, but fans didn't need him to. The meaning was clear. Screenshots spread like wildfire, with fans interpreting it as a veiled shot at the eagle himself. Almost immediately, responses started pouring in. Supporters of Khabib accused Khamzat of disrespect, of biting the hand that paved the way for Muslim fighters in the UFC. Khamzat's fans countered that he had every right to claim his spot, that he wasn't riding Khabib's coattails, but forging his own path. And while Khabib himself stayed silent, the noise around them grew louder. Fighters began being asked about it during interviews, analysts debated it on podcasts, YouTubers built entire videos dissecting the Dagestan versus Chechnya beef. What had started as comparisons became conflict, and with every passing week, the sparks threatened to ignite into something much bigger. In the modern fight game, battles aren't only fought inside the cage, they're waged on Instagram, Twitter, and every platform where fans gather. And for Khabib and Khamzat, social media became the arena where the rivalry truly exploded. Khamzat, never one to shy away from attention, began posting more aggressively. He dropped cryptic captions about fighters ducking him, about wolves hunting while others talked. Fans quickly filled in the blanks. The others he referred to were Khabib's team, perhaps even Khabib himself. It didn't take long for Ali Abdelaziz, Khabib's manager, to fire back. Known for his combative presence online, Ali lashed out at Khamzat in tweets and interviews. He accused him of disrespect, claimed he wasn't in Khabib's league, and suggested he should focus on proving himself before daring to mention Khabib's name. These comments poured gasoline on the fire. The MMA community ate it up. Clips of Ali's interviews went viral, side by side with Khamzat's fiery Instagram posts. Fans from Dagestan and Chechnya clashed in comment sections, fans, trading insults and defending their heroes. It was no longer just a fighter rivalry. It was a cultural tug-of-war being played out on the biggest stage in combat sports. Khamzat thrived in the chaos. He doubled down, reposting fan edits that showed him smashing opponents with captions like, "I eat them all." While he never outright disrespected Khabib by name, his tone was clear. He was ready to claim the throne, and he wasn't waiting for permission. Khabib, true to form, didn't respond directly. His silence, however, spoke volumes. To some, it was the silence of a man above the noise, someone who had nothing to prove. To others, it looked like disapproval, that Khabib saw Khamzat as brash, undisciplined, and unworthy of the respect he demanded. The clash of styles, Khabib's quiet dignity versus Khamzat's loud bravado, was playing out in real time, and the world was watching, refreshing feeds daily, waiting for the next post, the next quote, the next escalation. But beneath the social media spectacle, the conflict cut deeper than callouts. At its core, this wasn't just about fighting, it was about faith, loyalty, and the very values each man represented. To understand why the tension between Khabib and Khamzat resonated so deeply, you have to understand what they each stood for. For Khabib, fighting was never just about wins and losses. It was about legacy, family, and above all, respect. Raised under the guidance of his father Abdulmanap, Khabib's career was built on principles: loyalty to his team, humility in victory, and discipline outside the cage. He often spoke about the importance of living as a role model for young Muslims worldwide. His faith wasn't a marketing tool, it was the backbone of his entire life. Khamzat, on the other hand, embodied a different philosophy. He too was a devout Muslim, proud of his roots and open about his beliefs. But his approach to the fight game was raw, aggressive, and unapologetically loud. He relished chaos, thrived on confrontation, and didn't care if his words ruffled feathers. Where Khabib valued structure and order, Khamzat seemed to embrace unpredictability. This contrast created a philosophical clash. To Khabib's supporters, Khamzat represented arrogance, a lack of discipline that dishonored the sport. To Khamzat's fans, he was authentic, a man who spoke his mind, fought anyone, and lived without filters. The conflict deepened when religious leaders and influential figures in the Muslim community began weighing in. Some praised Khabib as the gold standard for Muslim athletes, a beacon of discipline and humility. Others defended Khamzat, arguing that his passion and fearlessness were just as valid an expression of their shared faith. For both men, the scrutiny was intense. Every word was dissected, every action interpreted as a statement. Khabib's silence was read as condemnation. Khamzat's fire was seen as defiance. And fans across the globe weren't just choosing between fighters, they were choosing between philosophies, between two very different visions of what it meant to carry their heritage into the fight game. It was no longer just about who could win in the cage, it was about who truly represented the spirit of their people. And with so much pride at stake, the conflict was reaching a dangerous tipping point. The tension that had simmered between Khabib and Khamzat finally reached a boiling point when Khamzat began making sharper, more pointed comments about Dagestani fighters. In one interview, he hinted that certain camps avoided him, that some men talk respect but don't show it when it's time to fight. He never said Khabib's name, but to anyone listening, the message was obvious. This was more than just competitive fire. For Dagestanis, loyalty to teammates and elders is sacred. To even imply that Khabib's camp was ducking him was a bold accusation, one that touched nerves not only in Dagestan, but across the MMA world. Khabib, as always, chose not to respond directly. But his silence wasn't emptiness. It was heavy, deliberate. In Dagestan, silence can speak louder than words. To many, Khabib's refusal to acknowledge Khamzat was a sign of disapproval, almost a dismissal. It was as if he was saying, "You are not on my level. You don't deserve my attention." But others saw the silence differently. They saw a rift, a refusal to unite, and they began speculating about deeper divisions. Dagestan versus Chechnya, an old rivalry reignited on the biggest MMA stage. Fans debated endlessly online, each side posting memes, screenshots, and clips to prove their point. The UFC press only fanned the flames. Reporters began asking fighters from both camps about the potential matchup. Could Khamzat beat Khabib? Would the undefeated legend come out of retirement to test the rising wolf? Every question added more fuel to the fire, even as Khabib brushed them aside. The breaking point came during one heated back and forth on social media. Khamzat fired off a message that referenced loyalty, saying, "I fight anyone." Some people only talk about loyalty when it benefits them. The message spread instantly, interpreted as a direct shot at Khabib's famous mantra of loyalty and respect. That was it. The line had been crossed. Even those who tried to downplay the tension could no longer ignore it. What had begun as whispers and speculation was now undeniable. Khabib and Khamzat were on opposite sides, their philosophies clashing in a way that seemed destined to end only one way: inside the cage. But there was one major problem. Khabib was retired, and the UFC was caught in the middle of a cultural storm. From the UFC's perspective, Khabib versus Khamzat was a dream scenario. Two dominant forces, representing massive fan bases, with a storyline steeped in culture, pride, and rivalry. On paper, it could have been one of the biggest fights in UFC history, but reality was far more complicated. Dana White had spent years trying to convince Khabib to return after retirement. Every offer, every attempt had been met with the same answer: no. Khabib had made a promise to his mother after his father's passing, and to him, that promise was sacred. No paycheck, no belt, no opponent could change that. At the same time, Khamzat was climbing the ranks at breakneck speed. He was smashing opponents at welterweight and middleweight, calling out champions, and terrifying anyone who dared to share the octagon with him. The UFC wanted to push him as their next global superstar, but the shadow of Khabib loomed large. Fans, analysts, and even other fighters kept asking the same thing: could he beat Khabib? Dana White faced a dilemma. Promoting Khamzat meant constantly battling comparisons to Khabib, but pushing the Khabib angle also meant stirring a rivalry that risked alienating Dagestan and Chechnya, two of the UFC's most passionate and influential fan bases. Behind the scenes, UFC matchmakers floated the idea of a Khamzat versus Islam Makhachev fight, which would indirectly pit him against Khabib's protege. But Khabib's camp shut it down, unwilling to let teammates become pawns in a spectacle. Meanwhile, Khamzat's team kept pressing for big names, dismissing any suggestion that he avoid Dagestani fighters. The UFC leaned into the tension publicly while navigating carefully behind closed doors. Promotional videos highlighted Khamzat as the next great Muslim champion, but never directly compared him to Khabib. Dana teased the idea of dream fights, but stopped short of calling for it outright. Still, the questions wouldn't go away. Fans demanded answers. Could the Eagle return for one last flight to defend his legacy against the Wolf? Would Khamzat finally force him out of retirement? Or would the UFC forever be left with a rivalry too big to book? As time passed, it became clear that the fight would never happen. Khabib remained retired, focused on coaching, building his own promotion, and mentoring the next generation of fighters like Islam Makhachev. Khamzat, meanwhile, continued his tear through the UFC ranks, cementing himself as one of the scariest prospects in modern MMA. But the conflict between them left a permanent mark. To this day, fans debate who would have won. Forums and podcasts revisit the rivalry whenever either man makes headlines. In Dagestan, Khabib is still revered as untouchable. His 29-0 record a symbol of perfection. In Chechnya, Khamzat is celebrated as a warrior unafraid to challenge even the greatest. Their clash wasn't just about two men. It was about identity, pride, and the philosophies they represented. Khabib embodied discipline, humility, and loyalty to tradition. Khamzat embodied fire, ambition, and the refusal to wait his turn. Both paths were valid, both were powerful, but they stood in stark contrast. The legacy of the conflict is a story of what if? What if Khabib hadn't retired? What if the UFC had managed to book the fight? What if the Eagle and the Wolf had shared the cage, not just the headlines? These questions linger in MMA circles, whispered in gyms, debated in comment sections, and immortalized in highlight reels that splice their careers side by side. For now, the rivalry lives on in speculation. And maybe that's fitting, because sometimes the greatest stories in combat sports aren't the ones that end with a clear winner. They're the ones that leave us wondering forever. Khabib versus Khamzat may never have been written in the octagon, but in the hearts of fans, it remains one of the greatest unsolved rivalries in MMA history.